The butter had to be churned before sunrise, not because anyone had decreed it, not because a schedule posted on the wall demanded it, but because if it wasn't done before sunrise, it wouldn't get done at all, because after sunrise came the fire, and after the fire came breakfast, and after breakfast came the laundry, and after the laundry came the garden, and after the garden came the mending, and after the mending came the next meal, and somewhere in the collapsing middle of all of it, a woman on a cattle ranch in 1880s America was also expected to assist with carving, maintain the kitchen accounts, teach her children to read, treat whatever injuries the day produced, and be ready, always ready, for whatever the ranch demanded next. There was no end to the list. There was only the list, and the woman working through it, and the absolute darkness before dawn when the churning began. The American West of the 1880s is almost universally imagined through a masculine lens. The cowboy, the cattle drive, the gunfighter, the railroad man. These figures have been so thoroughly mythologized that they have effectively obscured the parallel story of the women who made the entire enterprise possible. Not as supporting characters, not as background figures waiting in farmhouses for men to return from adventure. As essential, irreplaceable operational partners in one of the most physically demanding and economically consequential enterprises in American history. The cattle ranching economy of the 1880s, which was at that decade's peak a multi-million-dollar industry reshaping the entire geography of the Great Plains and the Southwest, ran on the labor of women in ways that contemporary accounts documented extensively, but that later popular culture almost completely erased. What those women actually did, how they actually lived, what the specific texture of their daily existence actually felt like, that is a story worth telling in full. To understand what ranch life demanded of women in the 1880s, you first need to understand what a cattle ranch of that period actually was, as a physical and economic entity. The romantic image, a modest farmhouse, a few dozen cattle, open range as far as the eye can see, captures something of the visual reality while completely misrepresenting the operational complexity. A working cattle ranch of the 1880s was a small industrial enterprise. The large operations, spread across Texas, Kansas, Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado, employed dozens of men, maintained herds numbering in the thousands, and operated with a logistical complexity that rivaled many businesses of the era. Even the more modest operations, the family ranches that formed the backbone of the Western cattle economy, were working enterprises that demanded constant, skilled, coordinated labor across multiple domains simultaneously. And the woman of the ranch was, in most cases, the operational center of all of it. The ranch house itself was her primary domain and her primary responsibility, and describing it as simply a house fails to capture what it actually was. The ranch house was simultaneously a residence, a commercial kitchen feeding a workforce, a medical facility, a laundry operation, a dairy, a textile production center, a school, and a food preservation factory. The women who managed these spaces were not housekeepers in the domestic sense that word carries today. They were operations managers running multiple concurrent processes with minimal resources, no backup, and absolutely no margin for failure. A meal missed was a workforce unfed. A wound untreated was a worker lost. A supply of preserved food that ran short in winter was a family in crisis. The stakes of every domestic task were real and immediate in ways that are difficult to fully appreciate from a modern vantage point. Cooking at scale was perhaps the most relentless of the daily demands. A ranch feeding its own family plus a crew of hired hands, standard on any operation of meaningful size, required the preparation of 3 substantial meals daily, plus the ongoing production of the bread, biscuits, preserved goods, and dried foods that sustained the operation between supply trips to town. Supply trips, it should be noted, could involve distances of 20, 30, or 40 miles on roads that were, depending on season, either deeply rutted or effectively impassable. This meant that the ranch kitchen operated largely on what it produced itself, with supplemental purchases made infrequently and in bulk. The woman managing this kitchen was not cooking from a pantry stocked by weekly grocery runs. She was managing a supply chain, maintaining an inventory, and making constant calculations about what needed to be consumed now versus what needed to be preserved for later. The wood-burning range that sat at the center of most ranch kitchens of the period was a piece of equipment that demanded its own form of expertise. Temperature regulation on a wood range is not a matter of turning a dial. It is a continuous process of managing fuel type, fuel quantity, damper position and draft, a set of variables that interact in ways that take months to learn and years to master. Cooking on a wood range at altitude, in the low humidity of the high plains, with locally sourced fuel of variable quality while managing multiple dishes simultaneously, is a genuine technical skill. Women who had grown up on earlier frontier homesteads arrived at their ranch marriages with this skill already developed. Women who came west from eastern cities or from European immigrant backgrounds often spent their first months on a ranch in a state of near constant crisis with the stove, learning through failure at a pace and under pressures that left little room for patience. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment and tell us where you're from. We've got viewers from all across the country and honestly all around the world, and we love knowing who's out there with us. Bread was baked daily on most ranches, and the sourdough starter that made it possible was treated with the same care and concern as any living creature on the property. Because in a practical sense, that is exactly what it was. A starter that died meant days without bread, while a new culture was developed, which meant a workforce eating biscuits made from precious baking powder reserves, which meant a supply calculation disrupted, which meant a woman explaining to her husband why the bread situation had become a problem. Keeping the starter alive through summer heat that could kill it and winter cold that could send it dormant was a year-round management task built into the rhythm of daily life. Women who had their grandmother's starter carried west in a ceramic crock packed carefully in a wagon treated that culture with a reverence that might seem excessive until you understand precisely what it represented: a biological inheritance, a culinary anchor, a small piece of continuity in a life defined by displacement and adaptation. Water was a variable that shaped every aspect of ranch domestic life in ways that people accustomed to municipal water systems find almost impossible to fully internalize. Water on a ranch came from whatever source was available: a well, a spring, a creek, a rainwater cistern, and its quality, quantity, and temperature varied with season, weather, and geological luck. Hauling water was a physical task that, depending on the distance between the water source and the house, could consume a significant portion of daily energy. Heating water for cooking, washing, bathing, and laundry required fuel, which required wood, which required cutting or purchasing, which was another link in the resource chain that women managed. Laundry for a ranch household, including the work clothes of multiple hired hands, bed linens, kitchen linens, children's clothing, and personal items, was a weekly undertaking that consumed an entire day and demanded physical labor of a kind that leaves the body genuinely exhausted. The washboard, the heavy wet cloth, the wringing, the hanging, and then, if weather turned, the emergency retrieval before rain hit, all of this in summer heat or in the biting cold of a plains winter, with no assistance except whatever children were old enough to be put to work. The dairy operation, attached to virtually every working ranch, was another domain that fell entirely within women's responsibility. Dairy cows required twice daily milking with no exceptions. Illness, weather, competing demands, personal exhaustion, none of these constituted an acceptable reason to miss a milking. The consequences of a missed milking were immediate. Discomfort and potential mastitis for the cow, reduced milk production for days afterward, and a disruption to the cream supply that affected butter production, which was in many ranch households a meaningful source of cash income. Butter made in excess of household needs was sold or traded at the nearest town or general store, and the income it generated was, in some cases, the primary source of cash that allowed a ranch family to purchase the goods they could not produce themselves. Women's dairy labor was not domestic maintenance, it was revenue generation, and its economic contribution to ranch operations was fully understood by families who depended on it. The butter churning that began before dawn was the downstream product of this dairy labor. Cream skimmed from the milk, allowed to ripen to the right temperature and acidity, then churned through a process that required sustained physical effort and careful attention to the specific feel of the butter as it broke from the cream. Churning by hand is not merely tedious. It is physically demanding work that over the course of 20 to 40 minutes of continuous effort produces a genuine muscular fatigue in the arms and shoulders. Women who churned regularly developed the upper body strength that the task demanded, and accounts of ranch women from the period consistently describe a physical capability and endurance that surprised observers accustomed to the more sedentary existence of middle-class urban women. Beyond the domestic core, ranch women were routinely involved in the agricultural and livestock work that is typically imagined as exclusively male territory. During calving season, a period of intense, around-the-clock activity that could last weeks, women worked alongside their husbands through the night, assisting with difficult births, caring for rejected calves, managing the chaos of a barn full of new animals and exhausted mothers. A ranch wife who did not know how to assist a difficult calving, how to tube feed a weak calf, or how to identify the early signs of scours in a newborn was a liability during the most critical economic period of the ranch year. Women learned these skills through direct experience, typically starting as observers and assistants and becoming practitioners capable of managing difficult situations independently when their husbands were occupied elsewhere. Horseback riding was a functional skill rather than a recreational one, and the ranch women of the 1880s rode with a competence and regularity that the period's popular image of women as tentative riders completely fails to capture. Side-saddle riding, which is often assumed to have been universal among women of the era, was in practice frequently abandoned on working ranches in favor of astride riding that was more secure on rough terrain and over longer distances. Women who needed to cover 10 miles of range country to find a stray animal, deliver a message to a neighboring ranch, or reach a doctor in town were not riding for pleasure under controlled conditions. They were riding hard over terrain that demanded skilled horsemanship, and they developed that skill through necessity. Some ranch women were, by contemporary accounts, exceptional riders by any standard, managing horses that their husbands found difficult, riding distances that would have impressed any observer, and doing so routinely as part of an ordinary working day. Pause right there for a second. If this is the kind of history that you never got in school, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. We're just getting started. The medical responsibilities that fell to ranch women deserve particular attention because they represent one of the most demanding and consequential dimensions of ranch life and one of the least discussed. In the 1880s American West, access to trained medical care was, for most ranch families, effectively non-existent on a day-to-day basis. The nearest physician might be 30 miles away, reachable only on horseback, and available to travel to the ranch only in the most extreme emergencies. This meant that the woman of the house was, for all practical purposes, the primary medical care provider for everyone on the property. Family members, hired hands, and occasionally neighbors who arrived in crisis. The range of conditions she was expected to manage extended from the routine cuts, burns, sprains, infections, through the serious, broken bones, severe lacerations, complicated fevers, difficult childbirths, and occasionally into the genuinely life-threatening, where her decisions and her capability were the difference between survival and death. Ranch women of the period maintained collections of medical references, Gunn's Domestic Medicine, the People's Common Sense Medical Advisor, and similar volumes were found on the shelves of ranch houses across the West, and supplemented these with knowledge passed down through families and communities, supplemented in turn by whatever they could learn from itinerant physicians, from neighbors with medical experience, and from the empirical education of managing injuries and illness over years of practice. The herbal and botanical knowledge that many women brought to this work, knowledge transmitted through generations of domestic medical practice, was not folk superstition. Much of it was empirically sound, reflecting centuries of observation of specific plant compounds' effects on specific conditions. A woman who knew that certain willow bark preparations reduced fever, that specific clay poultices drew infection from wounds, or that particular plant infusions managed the pain of difficult labor, was applying knowledge that was, in many cases, pharmacologically accurate. Childbirth on a remote ranch was a particular frontier of risk and isolation. Urban women of the 1880s had access to physicians and, increasingly, trained midwives. Ranch women often delivered with the assistance only of their husbands, neighboring women who might or might not have relevant experience, or, in genuinely isolated situations, entirely alone. The maternal mortality rate of the period reflects these conditions. Childbirth was, for American women of the 1880s, a genuinely life-threatening event, at a rate that modern obstetric care has reduced to near negligibility. Ranch women who survived multiple pregnancies in frontier conditions were not fortunate survivors of a routine process. They were women who had repeatedly confronted a genuine mortality risk and come through it, often while maintaining the full operational demands of ranch life through the final weeks of pregnancy and resuming them within days of delivery. Child-rearing in this context was inseparable from the broader labor demands of ranch life, and the integration of children into the ranch's working economy began earlier and proceeded more completely than in urban middle-class households of the same period. A 6-year-old on a working ranch was expected to carry water, gather eggs, tend the kitchen garden, and watch younger siblings, not as occasional assistance, but as reliable daily contribution. By 10 or 11, children of both sexes were capable of milking, riding, managing smaller livestock, and performing a range of domestic tasks with genuine competence. Ranch mothers were not simply raising children. They were training a junior workforce whose contributions were materially significant to the operation of the household. The education of these children was another responsibility that fell primarily to ranch women, and it was one that many took with extraordinary seriousness under conditions that were genuinely hostile to formal learning. The one-room schoolhouses that are part of the romantic imagery of the frontier West were often many miles from the ranches they served, accessible only during weather conditions that permitted the journey, and taught by teachers whose own education was sometimes only marginally more extensive than that of their students. Ranch mothers who wanted their children to receive a real education, one that would give them access to opportunities beyond the physical labor of ranch life, supplemented formal schooling or replaced it entirely with instruction conducted at home. McGuffey's Readers, Ray's Arithmetic, and whatever other educational materials could be obtained and afforded were used by ranch mothers conducting lessons in whatever spare moments the day allowed, often in the evening, by firelight, after the last meal was cleared, and before exhaustion finally claimed the household. The social isolation of ranch life was a psychological dimension that historical accounts address with remarkable frankness. Women who had grown up in towns or cities, who had experienced the texture of regular social interaction, the comfort of female friendship networks, the stimulation of community life, often found the solitude of remote ranch existence genuinely painful in ways that their husbands, occupied constantly with the external demands of the ranch, did not always fully appreciate or even recognize. Letters from ranch women to family members back east are among the most revealing documents of the period, and they describe the longing for conversation, for news, for the simple experience of being in the company of other women, with an emotional directness that cuts through the period's general tendency toward restraint in personal expression. The arrival of a neighbor woman, who might live 10 or 15 miles away and be seen only a few times a year, was treated as a genuinely significant social event, and the hours of these visits were compressed with conversation, shared work, exchange of news, and the kind of mutual emotional sustenance that sustained women through the long intervals between encounters. Quilting gatherings, when they could be organized, served a similar function, nominally productive work events that were primarily social infrastructure, allowing women to maintain the human connections that the geography of ranch life otherwise made extremely difficult. The quilts that resulted from these gatherings were not merely functional objects. They were the physical record of collaboration, of shared labor, of the specific friendships that made an isolating existence bearable. Tell us something. What brought you to this video today? Were you already into frontier history, or did you stumble onto this channel by accident? Either way, we're glad you're here. Let us know in the comments. The economic dimension of ranch women's work was explicitly understood by the families involved, even when it went unrecognized in the broader culture. Ranch households operated on the understanding that women's labor was productive labor in the full economic sense, that the butter sold in town, the eggs traded at the general store, the preserved food that reduced the need for expensive purchased goods, the medical care that kept workers functional, the child rearing that produced the next generation of ranch labor. All of this had measurable dollar value that contributed directly to the ranch's economic viability. Ranch women who were widowed or whose husbands were incapacitated by injury or illness frequently continued operating the ranch independently, sometimes for extended periods, managing every dimension of the enterprise: livestock, finances, labor relations, marketing, in ways that demonstrated clearly that their knowledge of ranch operations was comprehensive and their capability to manage them independently was real. The legal position of these women was, by contrast, almost completely at odds with their economic reality. The common law coverture doctrine that governed most American states through much of the 1880s held that a married woman's legal identity was subsumed into that of her husband. She could not, in most jurisdictions, own property in her own name, enter contracts, sue or be sued, or control her own earnings. The land she worked was legally his. The butter money she earned was legally his. The decisions about the ranch's financial direction were legally his to make. The gap between the legal fiction and the operational reality was vast, and women navigated it through a combination of informal negotiation within their marriages, community norms that recognized women's economic contributions in practical ways, even when the law did not, and, for those with the temperament and the resources to pursue it, active political engagement with the emerging suffrage movement that was gaining particular traction in several Western territories during the 1880s. Wyoming Territory had granted women the right to vote in 1869, becoming the first American jurisdiction to do so, and its example exerted a slow but measurable influence on the political culture of other Western territories and states through the following decades. The argument most consistently made in favor of Western women's suffrage was not abstract. It was grounded in the specific reality of women's labor and women's competence in frontier conditions. A woman who managed a working ranch, who made decisions that affected the livelihoods of multiple families, who demonstrated daily the full range of practical intelligence and operational capability that the frontier demanded, was a difficult figure to argue should have no voice in her government. The Western suffrage movement drew energy from precisely this reality, and the ranch women who supported it did so from a position of earned authority rather than abstract principle. The physical environment that ranch women inhabited was itself a formidable presence in their daily lives, not background or scenery, but an active force that shaped every decision and demanded constant adaptation. The Great Plains, which hosted much of the 1880s cattle economy, are a landscape of climatic extremes that visitors from more temperate regions consistently found shocking. Summers brought heat that, in combination with the low humidity of the high plains, produced a desiccating effect on both humans and the landscape. Cracked earth, desiccated vegetation, water sources that shrank to unreliability, and temperatures that made outdoor work in the middle hours of the day genuinely dangerous. The gardens that provided critical nutritional variety had to be managed through these conditions with whatever water could be spared from other uses, which was often not enough, and the failure of a kitchen garden in a drought year was a nutritional crisis with real consequences for the family's health through the following winter. Winter on the northern plains was, if anything, more demanding. The blizzards that swept the Great Plains without warning were not merely inconvenient weather events, they were genuine threats to life. And the historical record of the 1880s includes numerous accounts of men and women who died within yards of shelter, disoriented by whiteout conditions, in storms that descended faster than retreat was possible. The winter of 1886-87, the catastrophic Big Die-Up that destroyed much of the open-range cattle industry in the northern plains, is remembered primarily for its effect on the cattle herds, but its effect on ranch families was equally severe. Women managing households through that winter faced conditions of cold, isolation, and resource scarcity that tested physical and psychological endurance to their limits. The fuel supply had to be managed with extreme care. The food reserves had to be rationed. The livestock that survived had to be kept alive on feed supplies that were frequently inadequate. And all of this while maintaining the basic functions of the household: cooking, tending the sick, managing children, under conditions that made every task harder and some tasks nearly impossible. The relationship ranch women had with the natural world around them was shaped by this combination of dependence and threat. The land was their livelihood and their hazard simultaneously, and the knowledge they developed of its specific behaviors, the weather signs that preceded a blizzard, the plant indicators that suggested water, the animal behaviors that signaled approaching danger, was practical intelligence accumulated through careful observation over years of intimate engagement with a specific landscape. Women who had lived on the same ranch for a decade knew that landscape in a way that went well beyond the visual familiarity of scenery. They knew it as a working environment, whose moods and patterns they had learned to read, whose dangers they had learned to anticipate, and whose resources they had learned to use with a thoroughness that reflected genuine expertise. The food preservation work that occupied substantial portions of women's time through the late summer and early fall was essentially an extended exercise in applied chemistry, the management of microbial processes through salt, smoke, sugar, acid and heat, in ways that extended the edible life of perishable foods through the months when fresh production was impossible. Canning, which was becoming increasingly accessible to rural households through the 1880s, with the wider availability of mason jars and related equipment, allowed the preservation of fruits and vegetables in ways that improved on older methods of drying and pickling. But the chemistry of safe canning, the temperatures required to destroy harmful organisms, the acidity levels necessary for safe preservation, the signs of failed preservation that made a jar's contents dangerous, was knowledge that had to be mastered, and the consequences of getting it wrong ranged from lost food to genuine illness. Smoking and salting of meat, pork primarily but also beef and game, required the management of a smokehouse over extended periods, with attention to temperature, smoke type, humidity, and curing time that varied with the specific cut being treated. Women who managed these processes well produced preserved meats that lasted through the winter in good condition. Women who made errors in the process produced food that was either unsafe or unpalatable, neither of which was an acceptable outcome when preserved meat was a critical protein source for the months ahead. The knowledge that produced reliable results was not written down in most cases. It was transmitted through observation and practice, from mothers to daughters, from neighbor women to newly arrived wives, through the informal apprenticeship system that was the primary educational institution of the frontier domestic economy. We're getting deep into the real story of how the American West actually worked. And if you've got a friend who's into this kind of history, now's the time to send them this video. The more people who know this story, the better. The social hierarchy of ranch communities, such as it was, positioned women not simply by their husband's economic standing, but by their own demonstrated competence and reputation. A woman known for exceptional dairy work, for reliable medical assistance to neighbors, for the quality of her preserved goods, for her children's discipline and education, occupied a social position in her community that was grounded in her own achievements rather than simply reflected from her husband's. The informal economy of exchange and mutual assistance that linked ranch families across distances operated largely through women's networks, and a woman's standing in those networks was determined by what she contributed, by whether she could be counted on, by whether her work was reliable, by whether she showed up when a neighbor needed help, and whether the help she provided was actually useful. This informal economy of mutual assistance, the practice of neighboring families helping each other through labor-intensive events like harvesting, branding, and building, was coordinated and sustained by women's organizational work in ways that are rarely acknowledged in accounts focused on the labor events themselves. A branding that required the participation of 6 neighboring ranches needed to feed 30 people for 2 days. Someone had to organize that feeding, manage the food preparation, coordinate who was bringing what, and ensure that the event ran smoothly from a logistical standpoint. That someone was invariably the woman of the host ranch, working in coordination with the women of the neighboring ranches, through a process of organization and communication that required both social skill and genuine logistical competence. The correspondence that ranch women maintained, with family in the East, with merchants in distant towns, with government land offices, with neighbors across long distances, represents a body of writing that is historically invaluable precisely because it was not written for posterity. These were practical letters, written by practical women to address practical needs, and their directness and specificity give them a documentary quality that more self-consciously literary accounts lack. A ranch woman writing to her sister in Ohio, describing the challenges of managing the winter food supply, the behavior of a difficult cow, the progress of her children's education, and the state of her husband's negotiations with a cattle buyer, was not writing history. She was communicating the substance of her daily life, and in doing so, she was creating a record of that life with a precision and honesty that professional historians of the era entirely failed to provide. Reading these letters now, across a distance of 1.5 centuries, the texture of the lives they describe is almost startlingly immediate. The specific weight of the work, the specific quality of the loneliness, the specific pride in a jar of preserves that turned out particularly well, or a calf successfully saved, or a child who read a full passage aloud without stumbling. All of it comes through the pages with an immediacy that formal historical accounts rarely achieve. These were real women, experiencing real lives, and they knew the value of what they were doing, even when the world around them was not always inclined to recognize it. The cattle industry's transformation in the late 1880s, the collapse of the open-range system following the catastrophic winter of 1886–87, the shift toward more intensive ranch management, the enclosure of range land, the increasing capitalization of the industry, changed the context of ranch life in ways that affected women's roles, along with everything else. As ranches became more settled, more permanent enterprises with more fixed infrastructure, some of the most extreme demands of frontier domestic life moderated. Wells improved, houses became more substantial, supply lines became more reliable. Neighboring communities developed, reducing the isolation that had been so taxing in the earlier decade. What did not change was the fundamental reality that ranch women's labor was the operational foundation of the domestic and agricultural enterprise, that without it, the cattle economy of the American West would not have functioned, and that the women who provided it did so with a competence, resilience, and ingenuity that the historical record documents in extraordinary detail, even as popular culture has consistently failed to reflect it. The women who churned butter before sunrise, who delivered calves in the middle of the night, who set broken bones by lamplight, who taught their children Latin declensions by firelight after a 14-hour working day, who maintained sourdough starters and smokehouses and kitchen gardens and dairy operations and medical supplies and household accounts and community relationships across distances that would defeat most modern imaginations. These women were not the supporting cast of the American West. They were its operational core, and the story of how the West was actually built cannot be honestly told without them at its center. The specific texture of their achievement is worth sitting with for a moment before the history moves on. Not the romantic version, not the sun-bonneted pioneer woman of sentimental illustration, stoic and decorative in equal measure. The real version, competent, exhausted, frequently lonely, occasionally furious, deeply skilled, pragmatically resourceful, and completely indispensable to an enterprise that was reshaping an entire continent. A woman who could manage a working ranch, who could keep its people fed, its animals alive, its children educated, its finances tracked, and its community relationships intact, was not performing a secondary role in anyone's story. She was running something genuinely complex and genuinely consequential, and she was doing it under conditions that demanded the full application of everything she had. The butter had to be churned before sunrise. She churned it. She churned it every morning, and then she went on to everything else. And the ranch ran, and the cattle industry ran, and the American West took the shape it took, in no small part because she was there, working before the light came up, doing what needed to be done. If you made it all the way to the end of this video, you're exactly the kind of viewer we make this content for. Leave a comment below. Tell us what surprised you most about how these women actually lived. And if you want more history that goes deeper than the textbooks ever did, subscribe and stick around. There is so much more where this came from.